On December 7th, 1787, Delaware was the first state to join the Union, and they'll never let you forget it. Well, depending on how you look at things, all of the 13 original colonies were already states by this point, because they had all agreed to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But the Constitution was written 11 years later, and we typically use the dates that the original 13 states ratified the Constitution as the date that they joined the Union. I say that we just let Delaware have this one. I'm not sure they have much else going for them. Anyways, Pennsylvania quickly became the second state when they ratified the Constitution 5 days after Delaware on December 12, 1787, and New Jersey became the third state 6 days after that on December 18th. Over the course of the next 2.5 years, the other 10 colonies followed. 1788 was the year in American history with the most new states, that being 8. The 4th through 11th states joined in this order: Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, and New York. The last remaining colonies joined soon after, with North Carolina becoming a state in 1789, and Rhode Island being the final of the original 13 to become a state on May 29, 1790. The process of the original states ratifying the Constitution wasn't exactly quick. The period between Delaware becoming the first state and Rhode Island becoming the 13th was 905 days long. Did you know that Vermont was an independent country before becoming the 14th state? Yeah, they were originally part of New York and then separated into an independent republic that only lasted 14 years before their government decided a political union with the United States was the way to go in 1791. They became the 14th state, and they were the first new state admitted after the original 13 ratified the Constitution. A little over a year later, in 1792, Kentucky became the 15th state after separating from Virginia. In 1796, the incorporated Southwest Territory became the 16th state, Tennessee, which actually used to be part of North Carolina before they ratified the Constitution. 7 years later, in 1803, part of the incorporated Northwest Territory became the 17th state, Ohio. By this point, the U.S. had given statehood to the vast majority of their territory that they had gained following the Revolutionary War, with the exception of the Indiana Territory and the Mississippi Territory. There were 17 states at this point, but we needed more. People at this time believed that it was the United States' mission from God himself to expand westward and spread their ideas and people from one end of the continent to the other. It was time for the biggest real estate deal in human history, the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleonic France. In 1803, the USA doubled its size by purchasing 530 million acres of land from France for just $15 million. 9 years later, Louisiana became the 18th state to join the Union. Remember those original territories I mentioned before that hadn't become states yet? Well, in 1816 and 1817, Indiana and Mississippi became the 19th and 20th states respectively. Illinois and Alabama followed in 1818 and 1819 as pieces of those former territories as well, becoming the 21st and 22nd states. At this time of history, we were basically getting a state a year. Imagine if this happened in the 2020s. At this point, the country looked like this, which was already vastly different from how it started out just a generation earlier. But do you know what's better than 22 states? 23. Look at that beautiful piece of land right there. We should make it a state and call it Missouri. But wait, no we shouldn't, said the anti-slavery members of the government. See, at this time in history, slavery was still unfortunately in practice in half the country. In 1819, when we had 22 states, there were exactly 11 free states and 11 slave states. When Missouri was proposed to be admitted as the 23rd state, free states were worried that it would offset the balance of power in Congress with more slave states than free states. So, the Missouri Compromise was made in 1820 that allowed Missouri to join the Union as the 23rd state and the 12th slave state, and Maine would break away from Massachusetts to become the 24th state and the 12th free state. Yes, for the first 44 years of American history, Maine was actually a district within Massachusetts, and I think that we should take them back. Just kidding, maybe. It would be about 15 more years before any more territories became new states, mostly because of the tension between free and slave states. But in 1836, Arkansas would become the 25th state as a slave state, and Michigan would follow in 1837 as a free state. Hey, we're more than halfway to 50 now. Florida was admitted as the 27th state in 1845 after being a territory for about 25 years, and Texas was admitted as the 28th state later that year, shortly after being annexed by the USA. Mexico wasn't too happy about this, and the Mexican-American War was a direct result of Texas being taken by the US, and I think we all know how that war turned out because obviously Texas is still part of the country to this day. Florida and Texas were both slave states, so to balance the scales once again, Iowa and Wisconsin were admitted in 1846 and 1848 as the 29th and 30th states, both as free states. Remember the Mexican-American War I talked about like 2 seconds ago? Well, after the war ended in 1848, Mexico ceded a whole bunch of territory to the US, including the 31st state, California, which was admitted in 1850 after a whole bunch of Americans ran over there to participate in the gold rush. Leading up to the Civil War, Minnesota and Oregon became states 32 and 33, and then we had Kansas. The history of Kansas becoming a state is incredibly interesting and controversial because of the uncertainty of whether it will be admitted as a free state or a slave state. I don't have time to get into the full details here, but the events known as Bleeding Kansas were essentially a prelude to the Civil War. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions engaged in violent conflict over the fate of Kansas in regards to slavery. Fortunately, Kansas was eventually admitted as a free state in January 1861, but by this point, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana had seceded from the Union, and the Civil War would begin less than 3 months later. Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee would also secede from the Union in 1861. So at this point, there were technically 23 states left in the USA. The Union never acknowledged the Confederate States seceding on their flags, though. They still flew a flag with 34 stars at the beginning of the war, then 35 when West Virginia split from Virginia to become a free state in the Union in 1863, and then 36 when the Nevada Territory became a state just a week before the 1864 election in order to help boost Republican votes. In 1862, the Homestead Act was passed by Congress, allowing any adult citizen to claim 160 acres of survey land by the federal government in the Western Territories, provided that they lived on the land and cultivated it. This led to a sharp increase in population for many territorial areas that were previously mostly unoccupied, and this is essentially the origin story for the next 7 states. In 1867, Nebraska became the 37th state, in 1876, Colorado became the 38th, in 1889, 4 new states were admitted, those being North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington, and in 1890 we got 2 more, Idaho and Wyoming. If you've been counting, we're now up to 44 states, only 6 to go. Utah is an interesting case in statehood because the Mormon settlers first attempted to become a state in 1849, but were continuously rejected because of their practice of polygamy. In 1857, 2,500 federal troops were sent to the territory by President James Buchanan in an attempt to remove Mormon Governor Brigham Young from power due to their religious practices and animosity towards the federal government. Decades later, Wilford Woodruff would denounce polygamy during his tenure as president of the church, and this paved the way for Utah to be admitted as the 45th state in the Union in 1896. Oklahoma is the 46th state and was largely admitted for similar reasons to the group of states that saw population surges as a result of the Homestead Act, although Oklahoma wouldn't become significantly settled for a few more decades than those states. See, Oklahoma was called the Indian Territory before it was Oklahoma, and it was largely where displaced indigenous peoples were sent before it began to be mass settled by white Americans in 1889. You might have heard of the Trail of Tears, which was when tens of thousands of indigenous Americans were forcibly removed from their settlements from the southeast and relocated to Oklahoma. There are still native reservations in Oklahoma to this day, albeit in a far smaller capacity than their existence prior to 1889. After the population increased from the settlers following the land run of 1889, Oklahoma was admitted as a state in 1907. New Mexico and Arizona were the final 2 states to join the continental USA, and looking at their place on the map, you can see why 1912 it would be inevitable for them to join, being surrounded by other states. So the question we should be asking here isn't why did they become states in the first place, it's why did they take so long to become states? Essentially, it boils down to racial and cultural differences. US politicians were worried that the states would not be able to culturally assimilate with the rest of the country because they used to be part of Mexico, and were included in the territory that the US gained as a result of the Mexican-American War that I spoke about earlier in the video. So it took over 60 years, but New Mexico and Arizona eventually became the 47th and 48th states. For a little while, that seemed like it was the end of things. The United States had overtaken their entire area of the continent above the Mexican border and below the Canadian one, and there was nowhere else to expand on the North American continent. However, we all know that there are 50 states, not 48. So why were Alaska and Hawaii made into states? Well, both had been territories of the US for decades prior to their statehood, with Alaska being sold to the country by the Russian Empire in 1867 and Hawaii being colonized in the midst of the Spanish-American War in 1898. It wasn't until 1959 that both of them became states, and in the case of Alaska, it seemed like the right time due to the increasing population, the strategic importance of its geographic location during the Cold War, and that it was still part of the North American continent. But why is Hawaii a state and not some of our other territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, or the Virgin Islands? Well, Hawaii is the only one of these territories to overwhelmingly vote in favor of statehood. The first referendum in Puerto Rico to become a state was held in 1967, with 60.4% of people voting to stay as a territory and only 39% voting in favor of statehood. As you might know though, this has changed recently, with the most recent Puerto Rico statehood referendum in 2024 getting 58.6% support. But things have changed drastically politically since the 1960s, and there seems to be little to no urgency for Puerto Rico to become a state, especially under a Republican administration for what would likely become a solid blue state. Most of the other United States territories have never held a referendum on statehood, and it remains unlikely that we will get a 51st state anytime soon. Several ideas have been floated on what the 51st state could be, with Puerto Rico being the most prominent, but Washington, D.C. also gaining some momentum in the statehood movement. Canada and Greenland are extremely unlikely to become states anytime soon, but hey, stranger things have happened. So, that's how and when we got to 50 United States. If you have any more details you'd like to share about your state's admission into the Union, please leave a comment and tell your story. This video was meant to be more of a brief overview of the topic, but each and every one of these states has their own unique story to tell and is absolutely worth looking further into if you're interested. Thanks for watching, this is Bay State History, signing off.